By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte ruled over the largest empire Europe had seen since the days of Rome. From the Atlantic coast to the borders of Russia, his word was law. He had crowned kings, redrawn borders, and humbled every major power on the continent. But at the heart of this empire was a fatal flaw: his own unrelenting ambition. After years of war, only one great nation still defied him: Russia. The alliance signed at Tilsit in 1807 had begun to crumble. Tsar Alexander I resented French domination and the economic disaster caused by Napoleon's continental system, the blockade that was meant to starve Britain's trade. By 1810, Russia had reopened its ports to British merchants. To Napoleon, this was not merely defiance, it was betrayal. And betrayal could only be answered with war. Napoleon's plan was immense. He would gather the greatest army in European history, an unstoppable force that would invade Russia, crush its armies, and force the Tsar back into submission. It would be swift, decisive, and absolute. At least, that was the plan. In the spring of 1812, the Grande Armée assembled on the western frontier of the Russian Empire. It was a sight unmatched in history: over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of Europe. French, German, Polish, Italian, Dutch, and even Spanish soldiers stood side by side beneath the imperial eagles. It was not just an army, it was an empire on the march. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon crossed the river Niemen, declaring to his men, "From this day forth, the fate of Europe lies in your hands." The invasion of Russia had begun. At first, it seemed unstoppable. The French advanced rapidly, expecting to meet the Russian army in a grand, decisive battle, Napoleon's trademark. But the Russians refused to fight. Instead, they retreated deeper into their vast country, drawing the French further and further east. As they fell back, they burned everything: crops, villages, even entire cities, leaving nothing for the invaders to eat or use. This was the beginning of the scorched earth strategy. Every mile Napoleon gained brought him deeper into emptiness. Food became scarce, horses collapsed, and disease spread through the ranks. The summer heat was unbearable, and thousands died without firing a single shot. Still, Napoleon pressed on. He believed that once he captured Moscow, the Tsar would be forced to surrender. It was the same logic that had worked against every other European capital. But Russia was different. Its strength was not in its cities, but in its endless land and unyielding people. Finally, in early September 1812, near the village of Borodino, the Russians turned to fight. The Battle of Borodino would become one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 250,000 men clashed in an inferno of cannon fire, musket volleys, and bayonet charges. The French attacked again and again, hammering the Russian positions at the Great Redoubt and the village of Borodino. By nightfall, the field was a sea of bodies, more than 70,000 men killed or wounded. Napoleon won the ground, but not the war. He held the field, but the Russian army had not been destroyed. They simply withdrew again, leaving the road to Moscow open. A week later, on September 14, Napoleon entered Moscow, expecting to find supplies, peace negotiations, and victory. Instead, he found a silent, empty city. The Russian government and most of the population had fled. That night, fires broke out across the city, deliberate arson, set by Russian patriots. Within days, 3/4 of Moscow was in flames. Napoleon watched the burning city from the Kremlin, the glow reflecting off the sky. It was victory turned to ash. There was no message from the Tsar, no surrender, no peace. Only smoke, ruin, and silence. He waited 5 weeks for Alexander to negotiate. But the Tsar refused to even reply. He declared, "As long as one Russian soldier remains alive, I will not make peace." Winter was approaching. Napoleon realized too late that he could not stay in Moscow. On October 19, the Grande Armée began its retreat, a march that would become one of the greatest disasters in military history. The retreat was a nightmare. The first snows fell early, and temperatures dropped below freezing. Horses died by the thousands. Men burned their wagons for warmth and ate their own mounts to survive. The roads were choked with corpses and abandoned equipment. Discipline collapsed, the once proud Grande Army became a desperate mob. Russian forces, led by Generals Kutuzov and Miloradovich, pursued relentlessly. Cossack cavalry harassed the columns, cutting off stragglers and raiding supply lines. Every river crossing turned into a massacre. At Smolensk, the French tried to regroup, but the city was already destroyed from their advance months earlier. There was no shelter, no food, only death and despair. The horror peaked at the crossing of the Berezina River in late November. As the French tried to build makeshift bridges under freezing conditions, Russian artillery opened fire. Thousands drowned, frozen or crushed in the chaos. Out of the original 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back alive. Of those, only a fraction were still capable of fighting. Napoleon, once the master of Europe, now fled his shattered army. In December, he abandoned the remnants of his troops and raced back to Paris, traveling incognito through the snow. He had to return before news of the disaster could topple his rule. When he arrived in France, he tried to downplay the catastrophe. He called it a temporary setback, claiming he could raise a new army within months. And indeed, he did, such was his power and charisma. But the illusion of invincibility was gone. The Russian campaign broke more than his army. It broke the myth of Napoleon's destiny. For the first time, Europe saw that the emperor could bleed. Old enemies rose again, Prussia, Austria, and Britain, forming the Sixth Coalition to strike the weakened empire. The 1812 invasion of Russia was more than a military disaster, it was a moral one. Napoleon's genius had carried him across Europe, but his pride had led him into the frozen heart of his own destruction. The snows of Russia buried not just his army, but the dream of a lasting French empire. And as he returned to rebuild, his enemies were already moving. The next chapter of his story would be written not in triumph, but in desperation. As the coalition closed in and the walls of his empire began to crumble.